Greetings from Chicagoland. You're listening to Munira's Musings, where your host Munira will showcase new guests each week to share exciting details about the journey to their niches. As we like to say, the riches are in the niches, and on this show, we'll share ideas on how to break through our invisible boundaries so we can start taking steps towards our dreams and create the life that we most desire. If you're passionate about impacting lives, then this podcast will give you some great ideas and equip you with the tools to quickly grow your business. Okay, let's get started with today's show. Here's your host, Munira.
Greetings from Chicagoland. This is Munira. You're listening to Munira's Musings, a show that showcases entrepreneurs and coaches and people from all different walks of life who share secrets to their success, the secret to their niche, and what makes their boat float. As the niche navigator, there are so many people out there who are always looking for opportunities, and so many have missed or they don't know where to start. It is our hope that when you listen to this show, our guests that we are showcasing on this show will tell you something so that you can find a silver lining. Our guest today is Danielle Marshal. She is an industrial organizational psychologist. This is a mouthful to say. Welcome, Danielle.
Thank you, Munira. Nice to be here today.
Thank you. So you have created culture principles, and you are committed to creating processes that shape the direction of racial equity or equality, or both?
It is equity specifically that I am focusing on, yes. Okay.
And you talk a lot about inclusion, right? What is the word? You change and promote equity and inclusion. So without further ado, let's jump into this. And tell us a little bit about yourself.
Always an interesting question. So I am a Black woman, a mom, a social justice warrior, someone who likes long walks on the beach, still believes in unicorns. I am multi-layered as a person, as many of us are. And I bring that to my work as a professional in being a racial equity strategist and an executive coach. And my hope is that through allowing people to simply be who they are and move into their own authenticity, that we will have an opportunity to really drive organizational change by making more inclusive environments.
That's amazing. So let's take the layers out first. We're going to go through the onion. Tell us where you're from. How did you jump into this? And, let's go to the beginning of time.
Okay, so I am a native New Yorker. That's where I grew up and was raised. And I lived there until I was about 18, went to college in DC. And from there, I had actually joined an Americorps program while I was at Howard University. And that Americorps program really changed sort of the direction of my life. And so I had been in school originally to be a radio, television, film major. And while I joined this Americorps program, it connected me to a nonprofit called Jumpstart for young children. And it really helped me to understand both the service component, but also how much I like connecting to communities in terms of driving change. And so now I have moved around the country an awful lot. I have directed a number of nonprofits over the years that have taken me from DC to Virginia to Louisiana, and now I'm in Baltimore, Maryland. And that's sort of, that's been the trajectory. But what ultimately happened for me is as I was moving around the country and I was working with these different programs, I I began to hear more about, or I shouldn't even say about, but I heard from individuals about the students and the families that we were serving. Now, I predominantly served Black and Brown communities in my work as a nonprofit leader. And the stories that they were telling were not accurate depictions of the communities that I got to work with every day. And so as a result of that, I kept thinking about the outcomes that these young people were experiencing, that their families were experiencing. And I realized, many people were talking about them from a deficit model, and it really was never about them as individuals. It was more about the systems that they were within. The fact that you may have been born to a particular zip code or not had access to the best healthcare or educational system. Those were more drivers to me of the outcomes that these students were experiencing, as opposed to just simply being in a Black or brown body. And so as a result of that, that sort of drove me to the place that I'm at now, where I am applying my background as an IO psychologist to really help organizations focus on change, focus on addressing systemic inequities in order to make sure that everyone has the ability to thrive because those barriers are being removed.
I work in a clinic, and thank you for bringing that. I work in a clinic, and most of the people that we cater to are people who have Medicaid. And this is nothing to do with, any color or race, but you talked about the zip code. And, Medicaid is there to help people. But they have created, okay, we'll give you Medicaid, but you have very limited access. Lots of doctors, lots of specialists, lot of people do not take this kind of insurance. And so that blocks people to find out. I mean, a dermatology clinic within a hospital system that takes this insurance will not have an opening till next year. Literally next year, and you have patients who need to be seen. So how then do you come in and help? I'm not talking color only. I'm talking about just having this. So you're right. You feel like if you were born in that particular zip code, or if you don't have access to all of that. So how are you changing that?
Sure. One of the things that I really have been a big champion of for any organization, whether it is a hospital system, a school, a nonprofit organization, is really applying an equity lens to the decisions and the policies that people are making on a day-to-day basis. And so when we talk about an equity lens, this is really important because a lot of people right now are using this language. I want to think with an equity lens. That's great that you can think with an equity lens, but sometimes you need an actual framework to use. And so when we talk about equity lenses, we're asking very specific questions, that are getting at what is the objective? So in the case of being able to serve the community who needs medical attention, like who are we trying to serve? In what way do we want to be able to serve them? How effectively do we want to be able to serve them? What is the objective that we're going after? But then under that, there's an opportunity to start asking more questions about some of the assumptions that we may be carrying. So what do we believe about this community? What is the narrative that we're telling ourselves? And so in systems, that's really important because a lot of times there are things that are both said and unsaid that people don't realize are creating systemic barriers. So if you're thinking like, oh, well, this community doesn't actually care as much about healthcare, or, oh, they have a drug problem or a drinking problem, or they're just going to have more children. These are narratives that people tell themselves that are very damaging, because when it comes time to now show up and provide the services effectively, they've already told themselves these stories. Right. So I want to get at the underlying assumptions that are happening through the use of an equity lens. I want to make sure that we're engaging multiple perspectives. And the perspectives that are needed are not always just the decision makers, right? A lot of times we approach the world from a very paternalistic viewpoint. And when I say paternalistic in this case, like I mean this idea that I know best. We know best, right? Instead of actually asking the stakeholders themselves, what is of value to you? So if I were to go back to these patients on Medicaid and ask them, what is important to you about timeliness? What is important to you about the treatment? How are you being treated, right? I actually genuinely want your feedback so that we can incorporate that feedback back into making better decisions, updating our policies, et cetera. And then, the other thing that I'm really focusing on is like, what are the unintended outcomes? So we talked a little bit in the beginning, and again, I agree with you. This is completely, it is about race, but it's also about culture in general, because there are religious implications. There are implications for people who may be LGBTQ plus. There, just whatever group you belong to. How we treat these different groups has larger implications. And so if I have addressed some of the assumptions, I'm starting to talk to more people to get their perspectives. I also need to analyze some of the unintended outcomes. So if I don't treat you for a year and it takes that long to get an appointment, what might happen to not only you, right, in terms of your health outcomes, right? Because I'm assuming it's going to, they're going to get worse, quite frankly. You have not gotten the treatment, the care that you need, but also what are the ripple effects? So if something happens to you and you're the sole provider in your family, or the main provider, and you're no longer eligible to work because you're now sick, there's a ripple effect to potentially a spouse, to a child or children in this case. Like it continues to ripple through the community. It may mean the result in the loss of a home. There are lots of things, a job, that you can no longer get to. And so when we think about the system change, we really need to uproot those assumptions that we're making, those unintended outcomes, and understand that we are all interconnected. And when one piece of the system fails, there are ramifications throughout.
Get it. Totally get it. So before we continue, this is really interesting. What do you mean by equity lens? I mean, for those people who don't know.
Yeah. So an equity lens is simply, again, it's a framework, a set of questions that one can ask themselves. And I've given you a couple of questions that you can consider that helps us to really dive into multiple perspectives. It helps us to surface issues that we may not have seen previously because we simply were not focused on them. So when I ask about like the objectives, most plans, most organizations have clear goals for their organization, but they're often driven by things like the leadership team, revenue. They're thinking about sort of the big picture, the company's sustainability. They're not necessarily thinking about the people they impact and their stakeholders. And so when we talk about those stakeholders, that can be anything from your employees to clients you serve in the community, to shareholders, right? It can be anyone. It can be the vendors that you're working with. So when we make decisions or we make policies as business owners, each person that we touch as a stakeholder is ultimately impacted by that. And so some of them are impacted in positive ways, and some are really challenged by the decisions that we make. And so when we're applying an equity lens, we're trying to make sure that the decisions that come out, the impact that comes out of the decisions that we make is as equitable as possible for all of our stakeholders.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. So you talk a lot about diversity and inclusion, right? I mean, this is something that comes into your path all the time. Why has this become such a big movement all of a sudden? Just so that people can get a little bit of perspective into this. I mean, not that I'm saying I'm ignorant, but I just want other people, my listeners, to understand.
Yeah, I would counter that. I don't think that this is a big movement at the moment. I think that for people who have been historically marginalized, we have always been fighting to be seen for our rights to secure employment, to get promoted within companies, to have access to good education, healthcare, et cetera. And I think it's just really coming to the foreground that for certain people, that there are problems in the system that may be caused by a lack of inclusion, by a lack of equity. The one thing that I would say that's really interesting for me right now is, because you asked about sort of why this moment is sort of coming to the forefront, I think COVID had a lot to do with that, right? This pandemic where we were home for pretty much 2 years watching TV on a loop. So you were getting to see the effects of the pandemic, who was ultimately impacted by this pandemic, who was the first to be laid off, who had to go to work anyway, and just brave through this really challenging pandemic that we were having, who was able to work at home, right? So there were certain inequities that started to pop up really quickly. who literally lost their lives in this moment. And certain communities, again, were disproportionately impacted by this. So I think there is COVID as the first issue, but then I would say it's almost a dual pandemic at that point, because the other thing that started to happen was the racial unrest in the states at the same time. And so we're watching this on TV. There's nowhere to go. So it's literally running on a loop for all of us. And we can't get away from the things that we are seeing, hearing, and experiencing. And I think there was much more empathy for people in this moment. And there really should have been all along. So the things that are coming out of these movements are things that communities have been talking about, whether, again, it is racial, ethnic, or religious, sexual orientation related. These communities were all talking about some of the disparities that they had experienced for many, many years, but people were not listening. They were asking for proof. Well, demonstrate it to me. And for some reason in this moment, I think maybe the visuals of what we were seeing, the data that was coming back, opened a lot of people's eyes. But I say that, and I don't think it's the be all end all, because right now there's definitely a pushback from many people who are not excited that DEI has made it to the place that it's at right now.
I get it. But there's a lot of buzz, right, around diversity and inclusion. There's a lot of classes that are happening. All the companies are adopting it. All of the bigger companies are also adopting it. And the fact is that it's now creating awareness, if nothing else, for those people who are in minorities, or, just accept a person the way they are, just accept that person. And that's what I feel. This is my opinion, but hey, you know what? I don't know if my opinion counts.
Here's the thing that I would say about diversity is diversity is all of the differences. And right now we are in this very odd pattern where the word diversity has become weaponized by certain people. And I say that because when some folks talk about diversity, they mean it to mean anyone who is not white, who is not cisgender, who is not Christian, right? Able-bodied, what we would consider dominant culture in the US. The challenge with that is the very word diversity, when applied in that way, only speaks to other people further. Because if I am using whiteness, maleness, cisgender, Christianity as my measuring stick, then everybody else is different. But the reality is, when we talk about diversity and its origins, diversity means all of us. And so in a moment where people are shifting away and getting really frustrated by this idea of, I don't want to have to focus on diversity, I don't want to have to focus on inclusion at my organization, we need to back up and realize this isn't being done just for some people. A rising tide lifts all boats. And in this moment, if we are able to get this formula of diversity, equity, and inclusion right, all of us benefit collectively. We have innovation, we have problem solving that does not rely simply on one group of people to make the decisions. We get the collective wisdom that comes from multitudes of people, backgrounds, experiences, etc. That makes us stronger. It does not weaken us. It does not cut someone out. It simply means we're creating more space for a multitude of ideas to exist at the same time.
I love it. So how do people find you, Danielle?
Yeah, the best way to find me, you can connect with me on my website directly, which is culture-principles, and that is PRINCPLES.com. Or people can reach out to me on LinkedIn, Danielle Marshal, and they can find me there. I'm also at Culture Principles on Instagram. I would love to be able to connect with the community and talk a little bit more about this work.
See, she's so excited about this, right? And sometimes your path changes. Yesterday, I was on a call and I listened to my mentor talking to another person and how things happen in your life for a reason. And she started out in a path to do film and radio and just but she's doing that too. So that kind of overlaps in her business. But that wasn't the path that was chosen for her. And most people like us, we're always looking out, oh, you know what, it has to fall in your lap. Sometimes it's just an accidental. And, my mother used to always tell me that recipes are accidental. This is just what happens. And so just like a recipe in a kitchen, if you don't have something and you improvise and it turns out to be good, just like that, sometimes in life we have given chances to improvise, and that takes us to a different level in our life. This is such a wonderful subject. It can get a little bit dicey. It can get a little bit irritable. I can understand that. But it is something we have to talk about, because as people from different cultures, from different countries that have congregated in this beautiful country of United States, there is a lot of cultures, if you're a foodie and you're looking at different food, then that's cultural food. Just like that, those cultural food come from different cultural people, and we have to accept that. And this is a big movement. So if you are interested, we can bring back Danielle and talk to her a little bit more. However, this was not supposed to be a political thing. It's just about how your path shapes you to do what you're supposed to do. She's called to do this work. What are you called for? What is your next step in life? How are you going to take what you have and find an accidental fate has something for you? I don't know, whatever, but start something. The idea for this podcast is let's figure it out together. And if you need help, there are people like Danielle, there are people like me, there are people, so many coaches out there who are helping other people shape their lives. If you ever wonder, what am I doing on this earth? Let's figure it out together. Because as the niche navigator, and these episodes that come to you, we are trying to make everybody's life a little bit better. And hopefully you get some inspiration from our guests. Thank you, Danielle. Ladies and gentlemen, if you are, on the fence, look her up. If you like our show, please like, share, and subscribe to our show. We will see you next week with another guest, another niche, and another idea. Until then, have a wonderful week. Bye, Danielle.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Munira's Musings. We hope that you found today's conversation inspiring and useful, so that you can continue making progress towards mastering your own niche. Please tune in next week for another episode. And in the meantime, you can follow us on social media at Munira's Musings on Facebook, and leave us a review wherever you're listening to podcasts. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.